let us introduce political commentator and Kiwi blog, probably the New Zealand's leading political blog, actually, founder David Farrar. David, welcome to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show this morning.
Great to be back, Michael.
Mate, I've just started, because you know what I want to talk to you about, but I was just introducing to our listeners this idea that Chippy had it all going quite nicely, really, thanks very much, and then along came Cyclone Gabriel, and he could be quite prime ministerial and stuff like that, and now it's all started to fall apart with his ministers.
There was a great stat I saw this morning, Michael, that on average he's had to stand down a minister every 6 weeks. That's actually absolutely astonishing when you consider we don't have that many ministers. But yeah, every week he is just handling internal scandals rather than trying to get out there and paint a vision of this is what you'll get if you give Labour a third term. Having said that, you talked about he was seen as like the best choice to replace Jacinda. I note that his main rival, who didn't stand in the end for that, is Michael Wood. If you look at what's just happened, yeah. I think you could still say Hipkins was a better choice than Wood.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I asked you because the really interesting thing, and I compliment you this on, David, is that you've done a bit of a timeline on the Tinetti implosion. Jan Tinetti, former primary school principal, now Minister of Education. She took over, I think, the portfolio from Chris Hipkins. And she seems to have, I mean, I've done it myself. No, I didn't do it myself. Winston did. She seems to have misled the House on a serious and categoric basis. Can you take us through that timeline, please? Because I don't understand why she's still the Minister of Education.
Yeah, look, happy to, Michael. What it comes back down to is every term the Ministry of Education releases attendance statistics. And they've become embarrassing for the government because, somewhat shocking, only 46% of students for the term we're talking about were attending school over 90% of the time. So what you had was, normally these are released regular schedule, and the term 3 statistics were due to be released before Christmas. Because they become embarrassing, they told the ministry not to release them. Her office specifically said, don't release them. The ministry kept asking, when can we release them? They went back 3 or 4 times. And the office, including the Prime Minister's office, were kept in the loop, said, we don't want them released until after we've made an announcement around truancy, because if we make an announcement first, then obviously it doesn't matter so much if people see bad statistics because they think we're doing something about it. The problem is, Tinetti got up in Parliament and asked about why were they delayed 2 months, and she said, I have no idea, nothing to do with me, it's totally up to the ministry. And that was clearly wrong. The ministry wanted to release them 2 months earlier. They kept almost begging for, they kept getting media requests for them, and they kept having to fob off the media. There is a question over when Tinetti knew. She says she didn't know when she answered the question that her office had delayed the data. Now, to believe that, you have to believe 2 things. The first is she doesn't know what her own staff do, that her staff feel emboldened enough to instruct the Secretary of Education not to release data without checking with her. But also, and I'm someone who's worked in a Prime Minister's office, that when she prepared for question time that day, ministers don't just turn up to question time, look at them 5 minutes before. The moment they get them, the office goes into a panic. They sit down for 60, 90 minutes, preparing what could they be asking, hear their answers. So you have to also believe that they never mentioned to her during that preparation. So you can be cynical like I'm on that, but even if you accept the minister's word that they only told her after question time, she then knew that their answer was wrong. And standing orders, the rules of Parliament say you have to get out there immediately, not the next day. Like, you should have gone back that evening and done a correction. And if she had, it probably would have been an end. But she didn't. She left it there for months. And then what happened is documents came released under the Official Information Act showing her office had instructed the ministry not to release it. She still didn't do a correction. Erica Stanford then complained to the Speaker, and only after around 3 weeks after she complained to the Speaker did she finally do a correction. So she's before Privileges Committee, I think, tomorrow. What they're going to have to do is they have to take her at her word that she didn't know before she spoke in the House, unless there's proof of that. But what they have to look at is, did she have a good reason to not correct her answer? Her response is, I didn't know that I had to correct my answer. Now, yeah, she's been in Parliament 5 years. You're a Minister of the Crown. It's pretty basic knowledge that ministers know standing orders. So, in a way, the Privileges Committee has to decide, is she just totally incompetent or did she lie?
What are the sanctions that are available to the Privileges Committee were they to find that she acted in an inappropriate or illegal fashion?
They have a number of sanctions, but they can be fines, technically imprisonment if you really want to get ridiculous. The biggest sanction is merely their finding. If they find that she has misled Parliament, she committed a contempt, that puts massive pressure on the Prime Minister to sack her. The last time this happened was over Winston Peters and Owen Glenn donation. Also, the report back from the Privileges Committee will generally get debated by the House. So she faces a potentially 2-hour debate about, did she lie or was she just totally incompetent, that she honestly didn't even know what her office staff are up to. And, when you're Minister of Education, you're expected to be, really say, a good role model for the education system. The problem, I think, though, is that Hipkins has so many scandals at the moment. It has had to stand down so many ministers. He's going to be reluctant to sack the Minister of Education. There is also a little aspect there that this may involve Hipkins too. He was the Minister of Education when the data was due to be released. She was associate and had delegated authority, but his office and him were probably kept in the loop. In fact, we know that once he became Prime Minister, his office were kept in the loop. Was he perhaps the person who got his staff to talk to her office and say, I don't want this release done, about to become Prime Minister, let's delay it till after the announcement on the currency package? So that's an unknown question also.
Okay. One of the things I've noticed looking at her on television, and it's the impression that I've got, admittedly, from my lounge hundreds of miles away, she seems under enormous stress to me. I know that ministers will be automatically, but she exhibits that, and she seems to not have a clear understanding of her portfolio, or really the ability to communicate what would imagine would be quite simple messages to the surrounding media. In other words, she seems out of her depth. Do you get that feeling?
Yeah, I do, and I think people often make the mistake and think someone who's been a specialist in a field will automatically be a good minister in that field.
Yeah.
You tend to always think, if they were a nurse or a doctor, they'd be a great Minister of Health.
Yeah.
A former principal will be a great Minister of Education. Not at all the case. The best, in my opinion, Minister of Health we saw was the accountant Tony Ryle. Because he was over command of detail of the portfolio. He bypassed bureaucrats. He actually turned up to ED waiting rooms and asked patients how they were going, etc. But he had no specialist knowledge there. And Labour, I think, thought Tinetti, she's a school principal, she'd be great. But she hasn't got the political experience or skills to be managing a portfolio well, because these are just own goals.
They are.
It's so avoidable. All she had to do is say, yes, we delayed the data because we thought it would be useful for people to see it in the context that we're doing something about it. End of game. But thinking you can get up in Parliament and blame it on the ministry when you must have known that the ministry weren't acting on their own basis, because surely you were curious as to why the data only came out the day after you announced it. You really think it was a coincidence?
Now, the other one, and since we set up this interview for today, David, obviously there has been the Michael Wood incident where he's been stood down as the Minister of Transport as a result of not declaring on the parliamentary register that he owned $13,000 worth of shares in Auckland Airport. At first blush, I thought, God, it's $13,000 worth of shares, so it's not a large sum of money, and I can't believe that you'd be bought off making decisions on the basis you got $13,000 worth of shares. And then on the second blanch, I thought, gosh, you've only been stood down for Ministry of Transport. You're still a cabinet minister. You're still drawing all the privileges. It's probably just work you don't need that you've been taken off you and get on with the other stuff. So I'm struggling to see, apart from a little bit politically ego and face, what the real damage to you is. But then the third aspect of this that's come out this morning is that he actually made a decision whilst Minister of Transport related to another airport that was going to be possibly constructed in the Auckland area, whilst he held on to those Auckland Airport shares. How does this end?
I think that changes things. I didn't think it was a sackable offence just over having not disclosed them and backdated his pecuniary interest returns. Then the second aspect that came out was actually when we found out, well, he hadn't updated the parliamentary register. He had told the Cabinet Office when he became a minister, but then transpires that he promised them he'd sell the shares, and 2.5 years later he hasn't. They actually chased him up 6 times. Now, I don't think it was really corrupt purposes, but it's pretty incompetent that you can't sell shares. He obviously just didn't think it was important. The third thing, which you just touched on, that he actually made a decision that financially benefited Auckland Airport. Putting aside disclosing the shareholding, selling them, he just should have recused himself. He knew he had the shares. He knew he hadn't sold them. And that one, I think, is going to actually make it harder for him to come back.
As Minister of Transport, you mean?
As Minister of Transport.
But he'll still be sitting around the cabinet table, retaining his parliamentary ranking and all the lot.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to understand, you'll know this, Michael, when you sack someone from a portfolio, it's a Clayton sacking. They still get a VIP car. They still in the BHO. They still attend cabinet. They still keep all their stuff. They just have a bit less work to do. Yes, there's a bit of political embarrassment. The real consequences if you get removed from the ministry, as happened with Stuart Nash. In 2008, John Key, who was opposition leader at the time, was attacked savagely by Labour because when he was associate transport spokesperson, he asked some questions in Parliament about Transrail, holding some shares in them. They were actually in a trust, and he ended up selling them quite quickly within a year and made a big loss. But if you accept what they said at the time, this was terrible behaviour, that an associate spokesperson for the opposition asked some questions in Parliament, how can you not conclude that having a minister who's a shareholder make a regulatory decision that stops a competitor to Auckland Airport gaining authority status, is obviously far worse. So this is one of the lessons that, when you go aggressively over people in scandals, your rhetoric may come back and hit you when the same has happened to your side. So I don't think this is yet over for what I think the original sin of not updating the register of pecuniary interest wasn't sackable. It was sloppy, but fobbing off the Cabinet Office for 2.5 years, not selling their shares when you promised to, and making a ministerial decision that affects that company indirectly, Hipkins is a real problem because if he doesn't put him back in, it's just more scandal. But if he does put him back in, he's lowered the bar.
David, the Nash inquiry has yet to also return its findings. We know that Nash has lost his seat. He's said he's going to step down from Parliament. Well, he is. They've already Labour's selected their Napier candidate for the coming election. And he's pretty much sort of going into the parliamentary gym, I imagine, and lifting some more weights. That would probably be his, some total of activity over the next 6 months. Having said that, though, there is an investigation, it's supposedly independent, as to whether he did the right thing, the wrong thing, what he actually did. When are we expecting that or those results back?
Quite soon. I don't believe it's been completed yet, but the latest I've seen is that it's sooner rather than later. I'm not expecting a huge amount from that because it's quite narrow. It's just about in terms of his decision-making there. What would be more interesting was if it was inquiring into the fact that the Prime Minister's most senior staff knew about his giving donors inside information on cabinet discussions and somehow were expected to believe they never told the Prime Minister. That was, of course, Ardern at the time, that the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister's office, knew about this because she helped sign out the OIA release declining the information. That would be more interesting. We've also got an ombudsman inquiry into whether they were misled when they agreed that the information shouldn't be released. So the Cabinet Office report, I don't think is going to have anything startling. If it does, that will be bad because it will mean that there was more than one time where Cabinet information was leaked. But I actually think the ombudsman inquiry might be of more interest there.
So, okay, we've got Nash, we've got Tinetti, we've now got Wood. Who else has lost their job or been...
Well, Meka Whaitiri.
Whaitiri's taken off, yeah. So it's not a good look.
And, you also had Kerry Allen not stood down.
For Radio New Zealand and her comments because a girlfriend didn't get... Yeah, that's right. A girlfriend didn't get the job. But it all looks messy from an outside perspective. None of these things of themselves are huge in terms of their impact upon my daily life, yours or anybody else's in New Zealand, you would think, apart from a few parliamentary staffers. But in terms of image and in terms of perception, it's the sort of activity that you expect of a government that's not going to be re-elected. You can look back and you look back at National, look back at Jenny Shipley and Winston Peters, that far back forward. These sorts of mini scandals occur when you're not really in control anymore. Do you get that feeling?
I do. I think that's right. But having said that, look, it's obviously not good for the government, but it's not necessarily good for the opposition because the media can only sort of report on one big issue a day. And it's scandal after scandal, which means the opposition releases policies into a vacuum almost, where they've released a policy a week and it gets a report, but then it sort of disappears into the ether. And the opposition and the government are fairly close in the polls, and for the opposition to win, they actually need to excite people about this is what a change of government will mean. You don't want it just to be we're sick and tired there. I've saw this quite a bit when the key government were in. There wasn't the same degree of scandals like where you've had 5 in a row like this. But, for example, when you had the Richard Worth scandal where there was an allegation of sexual assault, and Labour went home on this, and every day they're asking questions about it, and actually Labour and Gough sank in the polls because people thought they're not focused on it. So you've got the challenge for Nationalists. They have to comment on this stuff, but they actually don't want this to be the big issue day after day. They want it to be cost of living. They want to be the fact that kids aren't actually at school. Not the fact the minister covered up the data, but the fact the kids aren't there and what are the solutions. So it's not good for the government, but it doesn't mean, slam dunk, they're going to lose the election. It's still looking very close in the polls. I think the biggest casualty is Hipkins. He came in, as you said, with a really popular brand. He did well initially with the cyclone, etc. But that's just getting chipped away every week when he's dealing with this stuff rather than trying to sell a vision of what he wants for New Zealand.
And on that vision, yesterday we talked about it on the show, there is this new sort of electoral reform group who have come out with their preliminary finding. They released it yesterday. I see the 16-year-old advocacy group Make It 16 have as you would imagine, declared victory. This is the independent group who want to reduce the voting age to 16. They want to have a 4-year term, parliamentary term, and there was something else they wanted to do too. What was it? Oh, that's right, reduce the threshold to 3.5%.
All prisoners to vote too.
All prisoners to vote,
Yep.
I commented on this yesterday saying that, and you've got to put that together with the local government review that also happened last year. And one thing that's been missed in both of those, and we're going to be talking after 11 o'clock, as I said, with the ACT MP who raised it, is the radicalised, almost the constitutional revolution that is te ao Māori, Mātauranga Māori co-governance. It's in both yesterday's local election electoral reform document. It's in the local government reform document that came out at the end of last year. It's been a feature of the last 2 years. In a funny sort of way, the Nats got caught up with it to do with the place names changes, road signs last week. I'm detecting the same revolution as I said in my introductory remarks about the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, where if you don't define something, you leave it to the courts and a whole series of public servants to do, and you end up with the worst of all possible outcomes. What's your view on that?
Yeah, look, the best analogy I heard about all this was when actually National Party back in the 2000s were debating whether to change their constitution to recognise the treaty as the founding document of New Zealand. And I can't remember who it was, but someone got up and said, it is a founding document. It's the equivalent to the US Declaration of Independence, which is an aspirational document. It's not the Constitution or the Bill of Rights of the United States.
Yep.
It was an aspirational thing because there's no right to life, liberty, happiness, etc. But there was the aspiration. I like that the treaty was an aspirational document. If you want it to be a constitutional document, you need a couple of things. Yeah, first, you have to have it defined exactly what. Secondly, you need a way to amend it. You amend the US Constitution, you amend the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
But what we're seeming to be getting here is a document that is unamendable. Some people are saying it take on almost sort of supreme law and based on principles that can be interpreted eventually through the courts, I guess. But that's not a good way to do it. You need clarity. If you want to incorporate the treaty into supreme law, you should have a bill that says, well, this is what the treaty means and this is what we're doing, and you have a vote in Parliament on it. But it has just been becoming almost holy writ, and the local government review got very little information publicity. They actually recommended that every council be co-governed effectively.
That's right, yeah.
Not just have Māori seats, but that regardless of the share of the population, that they be 50-50. And that is a hugely radical change. It's actually the end of equality of suffrage for local government level, which we've signed up to 2 international human rights agreements. I would have thought this would have been massively debated, but it hardly got mentioned, and we'll see their final report in a week or two, and maybe that will get a bit more debate there. But there is a constitutional revolution happening, and it's not that it's necessarily wrong. We evolve as a country, we move with the times, but is one that's happening without informed consent, where people understand this is the change we're making, this is what the implications are.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, David. Thank you for that. Oh, and finally, like this, your man, now, very quickly, polling, you must have another one coming out relatively soon, so must TVNZ. This week. Okay, so you've got another poll coming out this week. I think generally, is it TVNZ and TV3 follow you by about a week? Is that right?
TVNZ did one fairly recently. I suspect News Hub will be out TV3 very soon.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I'll be fascinated to talk to you about that when that comes. But finally, the story really of 2013, apart from Chris Hipkins becoming the Prime Minister, is the rise and rise of ACT and of David Seymour. I'm assuming, because you've got very close connections to the National Party, I'm assuming that the National Party are okay with that. Because it seems at the moment, from an outsider's perspective, David, you'd have a much better and closer view, that Christopher Luxon is trying to position himself in the middle, which means that increasingly the ACT Party is nibbling at the right and the conservative right of the National Party, and he doesn't seem to be doing anything to arrest that. Is that your perception?
First, they're not that close to what their views and decisions on, but I wouldn't say they're that comfortable with ACT rising high. You want a viable coalition partner to your right, but you don't want one where they're getting lots of MPs at your expense. ACT certainly are doing very well at the moment, especially in rural New Zealand and especially with male voters. Quite phenomenally well at times. And some of those demographics, they probably get close to 20% there. The problem that creates is, yes, the politics is simple, that ACT taking votes off National doesn't harm the centre-right. National has to get votes in the centre of Labour to sort of get that majority. But there's a difference between a National Party in government that gets 34% of the vote and gets 45% of the vote. Under Key, when it was 45%, it was pretty much a National Party government with a couple of minor concessions. If you're a lot weaker as the major partner, you get to deliver less on your promises. You have to give ACT more of their promises, but also you get personnel problems. Less of your MPs can get to become ministers. Also, you find it harder to get diverse talent in because
you've got no places for them.
The fewer list seats you've got, which is where you often get diversity. So I don't think National is happy if ACT's growing at their expense. They understand that, yes, it doesn't change the centre-right. They've got a balancing job to do. If they get obsessed with we're losing votes to ACT and then they just try to fight ACT for the votes on their right, then they're not winning the votes over in the centre. But on the other hand, if you completely abandon the votes on your right, that's not good for you either. So as with all things, it's a balancing job. There's going to be some things, and I think they're making signs that around climate change and the farming sector, that they're going to have a change there, which will probably help them in rural New Zealand. So some of the stuff they do is going to be competing with ACT on the right. Some of the stuff like free early childhood education or claiming a health tax is obviously more for the centre. What will be interesting is to see where that balance goes in the next 3-4 months. Normally you still have shore your base up first, and then as the election gets closer, that's when you start trying to win the centre voters over more.
David, thank you for your analysis. I'll be fascinated when you poll. When's it like to come out, mate?
Hopefully, it's today Wednesday because it's a short week. I'd say Friday most likely, possibly Thursday, but probably Friday.
Okay. All right. We look forward to that, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. That is David Farrar. Without question, I think he's got the best political blog in New Zealand, Kiwi blog, if you want to go to it. But also, he is the Curia Research principal. So he's probably the most accurate of all the political polling. And that's what happens when you say, I don't care what my views are, I just want to find out what New Zealand thinks. And his Curia Research polls now are regarded as authoritative. And I think at the last election and the election before that, they were the most authoritative. But anyhow, his take on that.